"Why is Harrison standing outside the gate?" Ethan whispered, and just like that, the entire dining room went silent. The chandelier above the oak table cast a warm golden light across polished silverware and crystal wine glasses, but suddenly the room felt colder than the rain beating against the tall windows of Harrison Manor. I watched Victoria slowly lower her glass of Cabernet onto the tablecloth without taking a sip. Across from her, David looked toward the security monitor mounted near the staircase, his face drained of color. On the screen stood a tall man in a faded denim jacket, soaked from the storm, his silver hair hanging messily across his forehead as he stared directly at the front gate camera like he already knew we were watching him. Harrison. After 15 years, Harrison had come back. Nobody moved. Even the fire in the marble fireplace seemed quieter. Isabel stood beside David with one hand still wrapped around the wine bottle, but her fingers had tightened so hard around the glass neck that her knuckles had turned pale. Eleanor remained seated beneath the chandelier, her pastel cardigan folded neatly around her fragile shoulders, though I noticed her breathing had changed. Small, uneven, afraid. Thomas adjusted his glasses and looked down at his untouched plate, as if avoiding Harrison's face on the monitor might somehow erase him from existence. Only James, the old family butler who had served this house longer than anyone else, remained calm. He stared at the screen for several seconds before quietly setting a tray onto the sideboard. "Should I let him in?" he asked. Nobody answered. Rainwater streamed down the security camera lens outside, blurring Harrison's face for a moment before the image sharpened again. Older now, rougher, but his eyes looked exactly the same, sharp enough to cut through every lie sitting around that table. David stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "He's not supposed to be here," he muttered, though it sounded less like anger and more like fear. Ethan frowned from the far end of the table. "Why does everyone act like he's dangerous?" he asked quietly. Victoria finally looked at him. "Because some people destroy everything they touch," she said in a cold voice. But before anyone could respond, the deep sound of the mansion's front door echoed through the hallway downstairs. James had already opened it. Isabel closed her eyes for one brief second. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table, and somewhere beyond the grand staircase, slow footsteps began moving across the marble floor toward the dining room. The footsteps were slow, calm, measured. Each one echoed across the marble hallway with the kind of confidence that only belonged to someone who no longer cared whether they were welcome or not. Nobody at the table spoke as Harrison finally appeared in the doorway of the dining room. The storm behind him framed his silhouette for a brief moment before James quietly closed the front door somewhere down the hall. Rainwater darkened Harrison's old denim jacket, and his work boots left faint marks across the polished floor that Victoria normally would have complained about immediately. "Tonight," she said nothing. Harrison looked around the room once before removing his gloves. His eyes moved from the chandelier to the fireplace, then across the long oak table where generations of the Harrison family had once celebrated birthdays, business deals, and holidays together. "Still using the same ugly chairs," he said quietly. Ethan almost smiled. Nobody else did. David remained standing near the end of the table with one hand pressed against the back of his chair like he needed it to stay upright. Isabel slowly set the wine bottle down beside the crystal glasses and folded her arms tightly across her waist. Eleanor could not stop staring at Harrison's face. There was grief in her eyes now. Not shock, not fear, grief. James pulled out a chair near the far end of the table. "Would you like dinner, sir?" he asked softly. "Sir." Ethan noticed it immediately. James had not called anyone else in that room sir all evening. Harrison glanced toward the untouched roast sitting beneath the dining room lights. "No," he replied. "I did not come back for dinner." The silence after that sentence felt heavier than before. Outside, thunder rolled across the property, rattling the tall windows overlooking the dark gardens behind the mansion. Thomas cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses again. "We were under the impression you left the country," he said carefully. Harrison looked at him for several seconds before answering. "That was the story you preferred." Thomas lowered his eyes immediately. Ethan felt something shift in the room then. It was small, almost invisible, but undeniable. Nobody was reacting to Harrison like a criminal returning home. They were reacting like a secret had walked back into the house after refusing to stay buried. Victoria finally reached for her wine glass. Her hand trembled slightly before she steadied it against the tablecloth. 15 years, she said coldly. And suddenly you appear at my door during a family dinner. Harrison slowly removed his wet jacket and handed it to James. No, Victoria, he replied. I appeared at my family's house. Ethan had heard stories about Harrison his entire life, but sitting across from him now felt strangely unreal, like finally meeting the shadow everyone in the family pretended not to see. Growing up inside Harrison Manor meant learning very quickly which subjects ended conversations. Harrison was one of them. Whenever Ethan asked about the man in the old photographs near the library staircase, Victoria would simply say he made his choices. David usually stayed silent. Eleanor always changed the subject, and Thomas once told him that certain people were better left in the past. Yet nobody had ever explained what Harrison had actually done. That was the part Ethan suddenly could not stop thinking about as the dining room sat frozen around him. Harrison remained standing near the fireplace now, warming his hands slightly near the flames while James quietly poured him a glass of water. Not wine, just water. Another detail that somehow felt important. Isabel stared down at her untouched plate, though Ethan noticed she had not stopped watching Harrison since he entered the room. Not openly, just in reflections, in the dark glass of the windows, in the silver serving trays beside the wall. David finally sat back down, but his shoulders remained tense. Beneath his charcoal suit, "You should have called first," he said carefully. Harrison looked toward him with an expression Ethan could not fully read. There was disappointment there, maybe even sympathy. Would that have changed anything? Harrison asked. David did not answer. Thunder rolled again outside, softer this time, while rain continued sliding down the mansion windows overlooking the empty gardens. Ethan suddenly remembered something strange from years ago. He could not have been older than 10. He had wandered into the west hallway late at night after a thunderstorm and found Eleanor sitting alone on the floor outside the locked study, holding a photograph in her lap. She had looked terrified when she saw him. The next morning, the photograph was gone, and the study remained locked for another 3 years. At the time, he thought nothing of it. Now, sitting in this room, the memory returned so sharply it made his chest tighten. Harrison slowly turned toward the long line of family portraits hanging across the dining room wall. Oil paintings, black and white photographs, generations of polished faces dressed in expensive suits and pearl necklaces. Perfect families, perfect reputations. Harrison studied them quietly before speaking again. Interesting, he said softly. You removed mine. Nobody at the table moved. Then Eleanor finally spoke for the first time that evening. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Victoria said it was necessary. Harrison nodded slowly, though his eyes never left the empty space on the wall where his portrait used to hang. Of course she did, he replied. James quietly placed a fresh log into the fireplace, and the crackling sound briefly filled the silence that nobody else seemed willing to touch. Ethan watched Harrison carefully now. The stories had always painted him as reckless, dangerous, a man who nearly destroyed the Harrison family fortune before disappearing without explanation. But nothing about the man standing near the fire matched the image Ethan had carried since childhood. Harrison looked tired, yes. Older, weathered by years outside the polished world of Harrison Manor. Yet there was something steady about him that the others around the table did not have tonight, especially Victoria. She remained perfectly composed on the surface, but Ethan noticed the tiny details she could no longer fully control. The way she kept adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. The way her eyes flickered toward Thomas every few seconds. The way she refused to look directly at Harrison for longer than a moment at a time. Isabel suddenly stood from her chair. I think everyone is exhausted, she said softly. This is probably not the best night for old family discussions. Harrison glanced toward her. You always did know how to calm a room, he replied. Isabel froze slightly after he said it. David looked between them immediately. Not angry, confused. Ethan noticed that too. There were histories inside this family nobody had ever explained to him. Histories that seemed to move silently beneath every sentence spoken tonight. Thomas reached for his wine glass, but stopped halfway when Harrison spoke again. Do you still keep the Zurich records locked in the upstairs study? The room went still again. Thomas slowly lowered his hand back onto the tablecloth. I do not know what you are referring to, he answered carefully. Harrison almost smiled. Not warmly, more like someone hearing a familiar lie repeated for the 100th time. Interesting, he said quietly. You used to remember every account number by heart. Ethan looked toward David, expecting some reaction, but David was staring at Thomas now with growing unease. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, as if the conversation itself physically hurt her. James continued serving plates no one was eating. Outside, the rain had softened into a steady whisper against the mansion windows. Harrison finally walked toward the long oak table and rested one hand lightly against the back of an empty chair. You know what fascinated me most all these years? He asked calmly. Nobody answered. His eyes moved slowly across the room before settling on Victoria. Not one of you ever asked where the missing money actually went. Victoria's expression hardened instantly. Because we already knew who took it, she replied coldly. Harrison nodded once. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a small silver key onto the dining table beside Thomas's plate. The color drained from Thomas's face immediately. Ethan leaned forward slightly. He did not know what the key belonged to, but suddenly everyone else in the room looked terrified. For a long moment, nobody touched the silver key resting beside Thomas's plate. The fire continued crackling softly behind Harrison while rain slid down the tall dining room windows in slow, uneven lines. Ethan could feel tension spreading through the room like smoke. Victoria finally leaned back in her chair and folded her hands calmly together, but her voice came out sharper than before. You always loved dramatic entrances, she said coldly. Harrison ignored her completely. His attention remained fixed on Thomas, who still had not looked directly at the key. Ethan had never seen the family attorney nervous before. Thomas Harrison had represented this family for more than 30 years. He handled estates, contracts, trusts, everything connected to the Harrison fortune. As a child, Ethan thought the man looked unshakable. Tonight, Thomas looked old. Harrison slowly walked around the edge of the table, his boots barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. Tell them what the key opens, he said quietly. Thomas adjusted his glasses again, buying time. I do not think this conversation is appropriate, he replied carefully. Harrison stopped beside Eleanor's chair. 15 years, he said softly. You all had 15 years to have appropriate conversations. Eleanor lowered her eyes into her lap. Ethan noticed her hands trembling against the pastel fabric of her cardigan. Isabel suddenly reached for her wine glass, then stopped before taking a sip. David, she said gently, maybe we should continue this tomorrow. But David was no longer listening to her. His eyes remained fixed on the silver key. What does it open? He asked. Thomas swallowed once before answering. A deposit box. Silence again. Ethan frowned. That is all, he asked. Nobody answered him. Harrison finally looked toward Ethan directly for the first time that night. There was something almost sympathetic in his expression now. Your grandfather believed important things should never stay inside the house, he said calmly. Especially the truth. Victoria immediately stood from her chair. Enough, she snapped. The sudden sharpness in her voice startled even David. This family survived perfectly well without you, Harrison. Whatever game you are playing, it ends tonight. Harrison turned slowly toward her. You still think this is about revenge, he replied. That is why you never saw what was happening. Ethan noticed Isabel close her eyes briefly after that sentence, almost like she already knew where this conversation was heading. James quietly entered the room carrying a folded towel for Harrison's wet jacket. But before he reached the fireplace, the mansion doorbell echoed loudly through the house. Everyone froze again. It was nearly 10:30 at night in the middle of a storm. James looked toward Victoria for instructions, but Harrison spoke first. That will be Sophia, he said calmly. Thomas's face lost what little color it still had. The doorbell echoed a second time through Harrison Manor, softer now beneath the sound of rain and distant thunder. Nobody in the dining room moved. Ethan looked toward James, expecting him to answer the door immediately like he always did, but even the old butler hesitated tonight. Harrison remained calm beside the fireplace, one hand resting lightly against the mantel while Thomas stared at the silver key as though it might explode if touched. Finally, Victoria spoke without looking at anyone directly. James, she said coldly, see who it is. James gave a small nod and disappeared into the hallway. The silence that followed felt stretched thin enough to break. David rubbed one hand across his jaw, exhausted lines deepening across his face. Ethan suddenly realized his father looked older tonight than he had just a few hours earlier. Not physically older, weaker. Like every answer he trusted his entire life had begun slipping out from underneath him one piece at a time. Isabel slowly stepped away from the table and walked toward the windows overlooking the back gardens. Her reflection trembled, faintly against the rain-dark glass. Harrison watched her quietly before speaking. "You should have told him years ago." Isabel closed her eyes for a brief second. "It was not my place," she whispered. David looked toward her immediately. "Told me what?" Nobody answered him. Eleanor pressed trembling fingers against the pearl necklace resting at her throat. Ethan noticed she had barely touched her dinner all evening. In fact, no one had. The expensive meal sat cooling beneath the chandelier, while secrets moved around the room like invisible currents nobody could stop anymore. A few moments later, footsteps echoed through the hallway again. James returned first, followed by a young woman carrying a leather portfolio beneath a dark wool coat dampened by rain. Sophia. She looked no older than 30, composed and observant in a way that reminded Ethan of attorneys he had seen on financial news programs. But unlike Thomas, Sophia did not appear nervous walking into this room. She looked prepared. Victoria's expression hardened instantly. "You brought a lawyer into my home?" she asked Harrison sharply. Sophia answered before he could. "Technically, Mrs. Harrison, this matter concerns the Harrison family estate as a whole." Thomas stood abruptly from his chair. "This is highly inappropriate," he snapped. Sophia calmly removed several folders from her portfolio and placed them onto the dining table beside the silver key. "Actually," she replied, "what was inappropriate happened 15 years ago." The room went still again. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as Sophia opened the first folder carefully beneath the chandelier light. Old financial documents, account transfers, signatures. Harrison finally walked toward the table beside her. "Tell me something, Thomas," he said quietly. "When you altered the Zurich records, did you really believe nobody would ever compare the handwriting?" Thomas's face turned completely pale, and for the first time all night, Victoria looked afraid. Thomas removed his glasses slowly and placed them onto the dining table beside the folders Sophia had opened under the chandelier light. The gesture looked small, almost ordinary, but Ethan immediately understood what it meant. The old attorney had stopped pretending. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows while the fireplace cast long shadows across the walls filled with Harrison family portraits. Sophia carefully slid one document toward David. "Look at the transfer dates," she said calmly. David stared down at the paperwork without speaking. Ethan moved slightly closer, trying to understand what everyone else already seemed to know. Rows of account numbers, Zurich banking records, signatures, transfers totaling millions of dollars spread across multiple years. David frowned deeper with every page he turned. "These accounts were opened after Harrison left," he said quietly. Sophia nodded once. "Exactly." Victoria suddenly stood from her chair again. "This proves nothing," she snapped. "Financial restructuring happened after the scandal. Thomas handled everything legally." But even she sounded uncertain now. Harrison remained calm beside the fireplace, while James silently refilled water glasses no one touched. "You told everyone I stole from the family before those accounts even existed," Harrison said quietly. David looked up sharply at that sentence. The room fell silent again. Ethan watched confusion spread slowly across his father's face, like someone waking from a long dream. "That cannot be right," David muttered. Thomas closed his eyes briefly before answering. "There were pressures at the time," he said weakly. Victoria turned toward him instantly. "Do not start folding now," she hissed under her breath. But Ethan heard it. So did everyone else. Eleanor suddenly covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Tears filled her eyes for the first time that evening. "I told you this would not stay buried forever," she whispered softly toward Victoria. Nobody reacted to the sentence more strongly than Isabel. She stepped away from the windows and turned toward Eleanor with visible panic. "Please," she said quietly, "not tonight." Harrison looked at Isabel carefully then, not angrily, almost sadly. "You still think protecting them is helping them," he said. David stared between them both. "What does that mean?" he demanded. Isabel looked down at the table without answering. Sophia opened another folder. "There is more," she said carefully. Thomas immediately shook his head. "No," he whispered. "That part was never supposed to leave the study." Ethan felt his pulse quicken again. Harrison finally walked toward the table and rested one hand lightly against the back of David's chair. "You deserve the truth," he said quietly. Then Sophia removed a faded photograph from the folder and placed it beside the silver key. Ethan leaned forward immediately. It showed Harrison standing outside the old boathouse behind the estate nearly 20 years earlier. Beside him stood Isabel, and in her arms, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, was a newborn baby. No one spoke after Thomas's confession. The storm outside had finally begun to fade, leaving only soft rain tapping against the tall windows of Harrison Manor while the fire burned lower inside the marble fireplace. Ethan looked around the dining room and realized the house itself suddenly felt different. Smaller somehow. The portraits lining the walls no longer looked dignified beneath the chandelier light. They looked heavy, like generations of people who had spent decades protecting appearances instead of each other. Victoria remained standing near the fireplace with one hand resting against the mantel for balance. For the first time in Ethan's life, she looked old. Not elegant, not powerful, just tired. David slowly lowered himself back into his chair and stared at the photograph beside the silver key without blinking. Isabel sat motionless near the windows, tears drying silently against her face. Eleanor could not stop crying. Harrison remained calm through all of it. That disturbed Ethan more than anything else. After 15 years of exile, accusations, and silence, Harrison did not look triumphant. He looked exhausted. Sophia carefully closed the folders spread across the dining table while Thomas sat collapsed in his chair beneath the chandelier, unable to meet anyone's eyes anymore. Finally, David spoke, his voice rough and quiet. "So, all these years," he stopped, struggling to finish the sentence. Harrison answered gently, "Your father knew the truth before he died." David looked up sharply. Harrison continued, "Charles was preparing to expose the missing accounts himself. Victoria panicked. Thomas helped move the records, and I became the easiest person to sacrifice." Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "I did what I thought was necessary," she whispered. Harrison nodded once. "That has always been your favorite excuse." Ethan looked toward James then, realizing something else. The old butler had known. Maybe not every detail, but enough. James simply stood quietly near the doorway with Harrison's folded jacket resting across one arm, his expression filled with the kind of sadness that only comes from protecting a family too long. Sophia slid one final document toward David. "There is one more thing you should know," she said softly. David stared down at the page. Ethan leaned closer and saw the Harrison Group logo printed across the top beside a list of financial acquisitions completed through an anonymous holding company over the last decade. David frowned in confusion. "Who owns this account?" he asked. Harrison finally reached for his jacket from James. "I do," he replied. The room fell silent again. Harrison looked around the dining room one final time. "The company would have collapsed 9 years ago without those investments," he said calmly. David stared at him in disbelief. "You saved the company?" Harrison gave a small tired shrug. "I saved what my father built." Ethan watched Victoria lower herself slowly into her chair as though the weight of the entire mansion had finally settled onto her shoulders. Harrison walked toward the doorway, then paused beside Ethan for only a moment. "Do not inherit their silence," he said quietly. Then he disappeared down the long hallway, while dawn slowly began to lighten the rain-covered windows beyond the staircase.